Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Nate Andorsky is the co-founder and CEO of Creative Science, a company using behavioral economics to build technology and digital strategies for today's most innovative companies. Nate, in his role as CEO, helps blend behavioral economics, design, and technology to facilitate social innovators move people to action, empowering his clients to dream bigger by creating digital experiences which, at their core, are human experiences. Prior to Creative Science, Nate was a team member at the Startup America Partnership, a nonprofit led by Steve Case to help build entrepreneurial communities throughout the US. He geeks out about technology and the ways it can motivate people to do good. Nate has been featured in Forbes, Huffington Post, and Inc. magazine. Nate, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Nick. I'm really excited to be here today.
Good. So let's jump in. I read an article of yours. I think it was on Medium or somewhere. And just scrolling through this particular one stood out to me because it was on emotions, human emotions. And I studied those a little bit in a previous life when I was in academia. So in this particular post, you talk about the underlying psychology and neurophysiology, some of the research, and there was this stat you quoted from neuroscientist researcher Daniel Lee, where he says, and you commented, that there are at least 3.7 times 10 to the 16 different expression combinations, which is about the same probabilistic space as two Powerball jackpots. So that's an impressive number. And yet most humans, vast majority of us, can easily and readily detect any number of these different emotion expression permutations. So I love that because, to me, evolution by natural selection, which of course worked its wonders on all of our psychology, but it seems so relevant for emotion, is such an amazing thing. So I'm just curious what your take is on emotions, and if that actually guides some of the work that you do at Creative Science.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, and I was remembering that article actually as you spoke through it and how it originally came about. So we do a lot of work actually with nonprofits, and we always talk about this sort of idea that as a nonprofit, you're in the business of selling happiness, right? I mean, ultimately, that's what you're doing is people are engaging with your organization because they want to make the world a better place. And nonprofits sometimes get into the cycle of, well, let's tell people how big the problem is, give them the stats, the numbers, and people will take action. And coming from a behavioral science background, we know that typically doesn't work. And one of the things we talk about is, you really need to move people emotionally with your mission. And the reason that article came out in sort of this approach was, okay, that's great, but how do I do that? And that's how we got into sort of the identifiable victim / identifiable beneficiary effect, but even sort of tapping more into that of, what is it about connecting with an individual that actually makes somebody emotional and moves them to want to take action. And that was sort of like the impetus of the article that I wrote.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it just makes so much sense that emotions are involved in a lot of these day-to-day decisions. And I remember a previous guest on the show I had was Jen Lerner, who's a researcher at Harvard Kennedy School studying emotions and different emotional appeals in various campaigns. I think she was working on smoking cessation in particular.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just in the rise in the last 10 years or so of this whole behavioral economics and applied behavioral science, it seems that emotions have been an afterthought or sort of cast to the side as unimportant or not even considered whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
Do you suspect that's the case in your world and in the work that you do, specifically in nonprofits, or is there more? Am I wrong? Is there sort of a receptivity to the psychology of emotions?
I think you're correct. I think that it's something that's often overlooked, and not even only in the nonprofit space. I mean, you also look about this, in the for-profit space. A large company like Nike, for example, if you've seen their commercials, I mean, they don't really talk about their product, right? It's very emotionally driven, it's story driven, and like that's what moves people to action, right? And that's what connects with people, is connecting with them on that emotional level. And there's also something to be said, I think, for, even making a decision that's emotionally driven and then using logic to sort of justify that decision. That there is this idea that even if you make a quote unquote, logical data driven decision, there's still emotion involved in that, whether you actually recognize it or not. So I think you're spot on there.
And it's almost like the emotion does its thing, whether, like you said, whether we know it or not, and then we post hoc rationalize and like confabulate and say, oh yes, of course it was a very like rational, logical decision, when in fact it wasn't whatsoever. It was being guided all along by these very powerful unconscious emotional urges. Which is fascinating. And I think as I just sort of think out loud now and in what we're chatting about, I suspect that the behavioral practitioners, although we might not be talking about it or dabbling in it, where I do see it playing out is in like marketing, branding and advertising firms, and not surprising you here. And I sort of my back goes up when I hear this term, but neuromarketing seems to be a big one. So I think they're really about showing their people in focus groups a spot or a commercial, and then hooking them up to some sort of physiological equipment, and then inferring emotion states. So I think they might be doing it, some better than others, but I think it's high time that we jump on that emotion board as well. Now, we were chatting before we hit record. You're sort of, by if I can say this, by trade, an entrepreneur. You're a creative type. You build businesses. But you're also, of course, like as you're CEO and co-founder of Creative Science, you're also a behavioral practitioner. How in your journey over the last 10, 15 years, how have those two identities come together, and was it a natural fit? Do you see yourself as one more than the other, or is it sort of both?
That's a great question. It didn't happen overnight, I'll tell you that much. Yeah. So I don't even know if you call it by trade, but my experience since I can remember, I was starting companies. So I had my first company in high school, and I've always been fascinated with creating, building businesses. And then in college, basically right after I graduated college, I got more into sort of just the technology space, right? So building products, mobile apps, websites, etc. And it actually wasn't until about 3 or 4 years ago that I stumbled across a book called Nudge, which is about behavioral economics, and Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. And as I was reading through the book, I noticed that there were a lot of the concepts, if you build products, some of them at a very high level you know of, right? So social norm theory, herd effect, some of those very high level concepts. But the more I dug into behavioral economics, I realized that there was a lot more than what I had learned from the UX design side of the business. And I was like, oh, I'm sure there's companies that are integrating, product design, behavioral economics. And the more that I dug, the more that I found that there really isn't. And that's when it started to sort of click. And then the more that I dug into it, the more that I found, and just really became fascinated with, what drives human behavior. I think that it's one thing to build an app and to change a color of a button from green to yellow and run an A/B test and say one works better than the other. But it's a whole nother thing to really, first and foremost, what drives human behavior from a foundational level, and then create concepts that most companies have never even thought of because they're working from a completely different playbook, and then begin to iterate and test those and refine those.
So there's the A/B testing. So there is some overlap. There's some common approach, but is it what you're saying is with your typical UX and product design, it's just a much simpler, sort of superficial, like they don't necessarily have that that depth of understanding human nature. Is that how you sort of see the difference between the two?
Yeah, exactly. I think on the testing side, they're just as sophisticated as the individuals I meet from the academic space. But where the big gap is, the common way to build technology, and this isn't a blanket statement for every single company I've ever met, but I would say the majority of them, what they do is they go out to their users and they ask them what they want, right? And they create an experience, and then they do A/B testing, and they ask the users what they like and what they didn't like. But as you and I know, we're not really consciously aware of what drives our decision making. So this whole theory and idea is fundamentally flawed if you're asking users to explain and rationalize decisions that they made that they're not even aware of what really drove those decisions. And then these creators, optimize the products based on that. They don't have the understanding to know that, for example, loss aversion, that people weight losses twice as great as subsequent gains, and really understand what's going on that behavior layer first, and use that as a foundation to then figure out what they should build. And it leads to a lot of waste, honestly, when building products, because you're kind of just guessing, you're throwing things out of a wall, but you don't really understand the underlying behaviors.
Yeah, so they like, without that background, like, no doubt they're brilliant. No doubt they're competent. They're good designers. They're good developers. They understand good product design and what users want, but they might be just in spite of all that, they might be asking the wrong questions. So
exactly,
they're curious, but they're going to save time, energy, money, all the resources if they go in with a more honed in and targeted approach and asking the right questions, given what we know about humans and
exactly.
human nature.
And just like a prime example of this is, Dan Ariely is the chief behavioral scientist officer at an insurance company called Lemonade, right? And one of the things that they were trying to do is decrease the number of fraudulent claims that were filed through their system. And what Dan did is he looked into, what are some of the things that drive somebody to be trustworthy. And one of the things that he knows from his research is that it's much harder for somebody to lie on camera than it is if they wrote in a claim. So part of the process of filing a claim is you actually have to take a video of yourself stating what your claim is for the insurance claim. But that's the type of thing, if you're not really familiar with behavioral economics and behavioral science, you would never even think of that in the first place, because it just wouldn't occur to you.
Yeah, that's great. I follow them. They're doing such a good job. And actually, just the other day, and I'm going to cheat here and do a search. It's like I'm on Joe Rogan podcast here, and I have my own personal assistant.
Yeah.
It was a blog post it wasn't written by Dan, but one of their leaders.
I saw that.
It was if I remember, of course I didn't read the whole thing in detail. I just sort of skimmed it as we do. And it was sort of tracking the number of fraudulent claims over the last 2 or 3 years. Anyways, it was from what I saw, and maybe this is a lesson and I should actually read everything from start to finish. It was quite compelling. The data were quite compelling. And I think they're doing really, really well. I don't know if they've gotten their Series B recently, but they've got a big chunk of cash and they seem to be growing pretty steadily. Very impressed by them. So for the listeners, I will find this post that I'm doing just a shitty job at explaining, and I'll link out to it.
The Sixth Sense? Was that the one you're referring to?
Maybe that's what that sounds familiar. Yeah. Is that what? Is that the one?
So they go through. I mean, what they're doing on sort of the behavioral science side, but also, I mean, they're doing a lot of work on the AI machine learning side too. And I mean, they've just come at this from a completely different angle, and I think because of that they're seeing the results that they're seeing, which is very fascinating.
Yes, I pulled it up here. You're right. 4 days ago, it was just got posted. So I'm looking at here. There's people in their videos, and I actually didn't know they were doing that. Their ability then is having people take actual videos. That is wonderful. I love it. And you're right. That is that's you cited like that as a good example, and it really is. It's just like after the fact, it's like it kind of is obvious and intuitive, but you would never have thought about it unless you had some sort of understanding. And that's why behavioral economics or behavioral science is so beautiful, because it seems so simple and it's so elegant. But you wouldn't have just stumbled across it based on your sort of gut hunch or your intuition or any sort of anecdotal evidence.
Exactly.
And I think that's the value proposition of this whole approach. So for you, it's fairly, you're still fairly, I mean, I shouldn't tell you you're new, but do you still feel fairly new in this world of BE and all that there is to learn and figure out?
Yeah, I would say I'm newish. I mean, I've been at this for quite a few years now. I mean, one of the things that excites me and what I've come to realize is there is a lot of research in academia in regards to what drives human behavior, and it's a lot of it sits in academia. So one of the big opportunities that I see is, I think there's two big challenges. Is number one is going into academia and figuring out how to actually apply this in a live environment, but number two, I think the challenging thing for us that we have always seen, and I think where the real skill set comes in, is it's one thing to understand the theories and understand case studies and how it was applied in certain situations. But you and I both know that a lot of this is contextual. But being able to think in a creative, abstract way to take these theories and then figure out how to, first of all, implement them in your specific use case, and then also test and verify that certain things are and aren't working. I mean, that's really, when I look for our staff and for hiring behavioral scientists on our staff, that's one of the big things that I look for. Do you have that sort of creative, abstract part of your brain where you can take the theory and figure out how does this actually fit into a use case?
Now for a short breather, a moment of calm reflection to discuss some important housekeeping items. For newcomers to the BS podcast this and last week, a warm welcome. You can find all episodes on any usual podcatcher programs, as well as on the website www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. For any direct feedback, comments, or questions you'd like to leave, you can always reach out to me personally at nhbehaviorist@gmail.com. And remember to subscribe on iTunes Podcast or wherever else you get your podcast fix. And if you're feeling friendly and generous, a rating and review would certainly go a long way. These were typically left on iTunes, though I just read last week an interesting set of statistics showing that Spotify is gaining some momentum in the podcast world. Catching up and closely on the heels of Apple, some people are even saying. So maybe it's high time we all switch over to Spotify. Not sure. We'll see. Anyways, spread the love in whichever way works for you. Hell, this might even be in a real-life, in-person conversation. The ones where, there's two human beings talking to one another, exchanging in conversation, that type of stuff. Lastly, I'm afraid to tell you that this episode ended up being cut short because the program I use, it's called Zencastr, was on the fritz during the time of our recording with today's guest, Nate. Zencastr, to you guys are great and all. I've had some most success, but you really messed up in the flow of this chat. I'll give you another chance. But no doubt Nate has tons of insight and unique experiences to talk about. So we only touched on some of those in this episode. He'll be coming on for part 2 very soon. But for now, we're gifted with his presence for another 20 minutes or so. So let's get back to it. So I'm glad you brought this up. It was one of my questions that I wanted to touch on, which was talent and hiring and how you guys go about building your team at Creative Science. I've come across behavioral scientists and psychologists who are still in academia or maybe transitioning out of academia. Maybe they're sort of existing in both worlds simultaneously. And they're brilliant researchers. They're brilliant scientists. They could out-research me. They could out-theorize me. They often will have like photographic memory, and they'll just sort of be really good scientists and psychologists. And yet, and this might be just sort of to make myself feel better, is they have this inability to do what you said, which is contextualize and think about these theories and these concepts in a more abstract way. It's almost as though their strength is their weakness. It's like they know the theory as it's applied in this world of academia, in laboratory or field experimental settings, but any time you have to sort of extrapolate that out to something that's different, it's difficult for them. So I wonder if you come across people in interviews or just who come across your desk interested in working at creative science, and how you guys broach that dilemma, if it's a dilemma for you.
Yeah, I would say, it's interesting because we actually, so our behavioral econ specialist, Heather Gracie, who's amazing, she actually, is from Carnegie Mellon, dual degree in behavioral economics and psychology. And, one of the challenges when I was hiring for this role, it was, do I bring somebody in who has deep experience in product design and development and user experience design and then train them on the behavioral side, or vice versa? And one of the things I found with Heather actually was she had all of the behavioral training, but none of the UX experience design training. But she almost kind of came with that already because she inherently understood how to build products from a user experience standpoint because she understood sort of the behavioral side of it. And, to answer your question, I don't have enough, I would say, data to really make a firm recommendation. I think part of it, though, is because she hasn't spent too much time in academia and she's gotten into the sort of practice side really early on, and she's learning as she goes, but also learning the types of things that work very similar to how they work in academia and the types of things that don't work at all similar. So it might be a byproduct of just, the way that you process information and think. It also might be a byproduct of, I think once you're in any type of job or any type of role for a while, it can be hard to sort of break out of that into something else because you're just so used to doing things a certain way.
Yeah, and I love I love how you spoken like a true scientist with the you add this this sort of caveat of, well, it's an N of 1, so
right.
Yeah, you passed the test.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
So you guys at Creative Science, you sort of have these, just looking at your website and knowing a bit about you guys, there's the sort of the behavioral, then there's the digital and the technology. When you guys deliver, when you guys are, working on projects with your clients, are they separate, or will they often come together and just be sort of different modules or different parts of the engagement of the process? What does that look like?
They come together. Yeah. So one of the things that we do is a typical engagement is the first part of the engagement is basically us going in and doing a behavioral diagnosis. So we build out something which we've called a base behavioral model, which is basically giving them an understanding of what factors are driving their users' decision making. Once we have that as a foundation, then we begin to say, okay, these are the challenges that you're having. These are some ways within your actual product that we would go about solving them based on the findings from the base behavioral model that we've created. And then it depends on the size of the company. So some companies, they have in-house design developers. We'll work hand in hand with them, giving them directions on how to implement certain theories. Some companies may have in-house dev team, but they'll just say, listen, we don't want to deal with it, and we can take it all the way through. So it kind of just depends on the needs and the resources of the client.
And I'm curious with the in-house dev team of your client, are they generally receptive to some of the recommendations that you guys have, if they're wildly different from what they would have done? Like what's their reaction to some of your guys' recommendations?
Yeah, it depends. It depends how wild they are. It also depends on, sometimes there's sort of legal reasons we can't do certain things. Sometimes very large organizations are just bureaucratic and they need to get sign off on everything. So that can hold it up a little bit. It's a case by case basis, just depending on what the culture is like at the organization.
And what's a typical, if I can ask this, is there sort of a typical partner and client partner that you work with in terms of industry? I know you said a lot of it's like social innovation stuff. Is there a typical project, and what does that look like?
Yeah, so we're basically looking, so social innovation, nonprofit space is one vertical, but we also work in the health, education, and finance, so around consumer finance. And we're looking at online applications that help individuals, and as we like to say, become better versions of themselves, right? So in the finance space, typically some type of online platform that helps people save more money, spend smarter. In the education space, it's a lot of e-learning platforms. In the health space, it could be, eating better, working out more, etc.
So different verticals. And in the education one, so what you mentioned, there's e-learning. Is it with like, would it be with schools or like university college institutions, or more like L&D at corporate, like sort of corporations?
It's more sort of online learning platforms, right? So whether it's within a company or there's a component of a school that has some sort of online component, we're looking
Mm-hmm.
basically at, the completion rates for completing online courses is extremely low, right? So
Yeah,
this is a
yeah,
really,
yeah,
really big issue, right?
yeah, yeah.
And giving people rational reasons as to why they should finish their educational content does not work. So we're looking at, okay, what are some of the other tactics that we can employ from a behavioral side? And Duolingo is pretty sort of famous for this way of thinking
Hmm.
into their platform to increase user engagement, retention, etc.
Hmm. I think you should reach out to I'm in Canada here in Ontario. Our provincial government, they, and my wife, my partner, is a high school teacher, and they're right in the smack dab of job action and union strikes, because a big push of the provincial government is to reduce the number of in-class teachers and replace it with an e-learning component.
Mm-hmm.
And not surprising, there's a huge reaction from the public, and I don't think, I, like, not to throw the baby with the bathwater. Like, I think there's efficacy to these things, but I think the way that our government is actually going about it is a little bit too it's everything seems in haste,
Right.
and so I can see both. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious, what are your thoughts? Like, there's value because there's the scalability, of course, of e-learning platforms. There's the convenience, but then there's also these concerning numbers, as you say, with lack of engagement and drop off. So what do you make of that, and what do you see some of these behavioral tactics working to get us on the other side of that curve?
Yeah, so and I think it's a really good question, and I think that oftentimes when you think about e-learning, you think about it replacing the in-person classroom experience, right? And there's this whole idea of blended learning, right, where the online component complements what's happening in the classroom. And I think there's a lot of power in that model. But I agree with you. There's a lot to be said for this in-person classroom interaction that teachers have with their students.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's what the evidence supports. As far as I'm no
Mm-hmm.
definitely no expert in like educational psychology, but I think that's what sort of hybrid model is what it says works best.
And I think also too, it depends on, I think it's one thing is if you have somebody who wants to and can learn in a classroom, and then you're trying to take them out of that and put all the content online, like that's a challenge, right? But if you're
Mm-hmm,
looking at the segment of people that, can never make it into a classroom, right? I'm trying to learn a new skill on the side while I also have a full-time job, like
mm-hmm,
that lends itself really well to this online learning component.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It also makes me think, and I don't know if you guys have any experience, working on these projects with. This is really in HR departments and L&D. Like your typical like corporate training and compliance training, and which is like, I remember working at a big management consulting firm, and I was like, you guys have so much money, and this is like your
Right.
training. This is
Right.
it was pathetic.
Yeah.
And obviously like engagement was close to zero.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm now reading a lot of sort of thought leaders in the space of HR and L&D that are saying you need these sort of like digital solutions that are providing training that's like as needed, or in what they say is in the flow of work,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to like sitting down and like, now is your time to do your compliance training, your
Right.
corporate training. It's like, no, just have it there when it's ready. Do you
Mm-hmm.
guys see yourselves getting into that space? Do you think there's overlap between that and what you're doing on some projects?
Yeah, I definitely think there is. I mean, I think, one of the challenges with that versus just the sort of pure e-learning platforms is there's this sort of intrinsic motivation when you sign up for some type of e-learning platform because you want to become smarter in some sort of a skill or subject matter, right? With the training component's a little bit tougher because you're not really doing it, or I guess you kind of are doing it to better yourself, but at the end of the day, you're just doing it to check a box. So that can become a little bit challenging.
Last question for you is what I call the BBB, the big behavioral brainstorm. So of all the problems in our society, which are plentiful, let's say, where do you see behavioral insights or behavioral economics or behavioral science? Where do you see that playing the biggest role in helping solve some of these problems?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit biased because I work on the behavioral side with technology. So, one of the fascinating things about technology is just its reach, right? I still think it's pretty incredible that you can could create a website tonight, and anybody with internet access can see it instantaneously. And I think that's pretty powerful. And where I see this playing out is any type of technology that helps shift long-term behavior, right? So I don't think that behavioral science or behavioral econ is the silver bullet and is going to say, solve every single problem that we have. But when we're looking at a lot of these applications and software that are built around helping people, save money, eat healthier, work out more, become smarter, a lot of them aren't built with a behavioral approach. And because of that, there's a lot of opportunity that they're leaving on the table. The second place I see it playing a really big role, I think we're at a space right now where, especially in the digital space, where behavioral econ is being sort of sprinkled on top of products after they've been built. But if we can get to a place where the behavioral econ is built into the core of the product, right, before we even sort of launch the business and the product, it makes it that much more powerful.
Yeah, totally. I love that. I had a client recently, of all things, a dating app, and they had built pretty much like to 90% of their MVP, and sort of ready to do an initial soft launch, and then brought me in, and I was like, hey, I think you should maybe take this approach. So I suspect you're right, and I'm hopeful that we're seeing more of that as there's like companies like yours and the work that you guys are doing, and hopefully this podcast getting out to the masses, and realizing that there is some serious value to bringing folks like us on at the outset.
Yeah.
At the
And I think it's also exciting. I mean, I was pondering this a couple of months ago, is, I think where you see data science today sort of precedes behavioral science by about 10 years, right? You're starting to see data scientists become the new hot, job, and that, chief data scientist officer at companies. And I think in the next 10, maybe 15 years, you'll start to see the same thing where, like, behavioral science isn't an afterthought. It is a department of a company, and it is a key foundational pillar to a successful company.
Yeah, and even like the sort of what do they call? Somebody wrote about this. I think it might have been Matt Wallert, who was on the show. Like the rising role of the CBO, the Chief Behavioral Officer, and I know he is at Clover, and a lot of the guests, I'm trying to think now, if so 18, about 20 guests, I'd say 5 of those 20 are in their own right, like chief behavioral officers in their own right. So I suspect you're right. And what's so even cooler, and what's even like the great thing about it is that they are in these different verticals in different industries. So it's not that it's a fad within one business domain. It's cutting across, which of course, because there's humans in all different places.
Yeah.
And humans are humans, as it turns
and
out,
with
right?
that, I think it's also going to be interesting to see. I mean, you see this in the machine learning space, right? Where people, like, you're a data scientist in a very specific part of data science, right? You do natural language processing, for example, right? And I'm curious to see, and I've read Matt's work and I listened to him, and I think he's brilliant. And I would wonder what he says about this too, is, are you going to start to see, behavioral scientists that specialize in like specific areas of a company, whether it's marketing or, cultural change or, whatever it is, that'll also be interesting to see how that sort of breaks out to sort of subspecialties underneath it.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS Podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.